In the arid heart of the Arabian Peninsula, where the desert winds carried both stories and secrets, a man was born who would alter the course of human history. His name, Muhammad ibn Abdullah, was whispered in marketplaces, sung in poems, and later proclaimed in every corner of the known world. But his journey to becoming the final prophet of Islam was not bathed in privilege or power. It began in the shadow of loss, his father gone before he drew his first breath, his mother taken from him before his 6th year. By the age of 8, Muhammad was an orphan in a society where family lineage was the currency of survival. And yet, destiny had chosen him. As a young man, he was known not for conquest, but for his unwavering honesty. Al-Amin, the Trustworthy. Merchants trusted him with caravans worth fortunes. Neighbors sought his counsel in disputes. In an age of tribal rivalries and blood feuds, his character shone like an oasis in the endless sands. But the tranquility would not last. One night, in the solitude of a cave outside Mecca, Muhammad would experience something no man before or since had endured, a revelation so overwhelming that it shook him to his core. The command was clear: recite. And with those words, history changed. Yet, not everyone welcomed this new message. What began as a quiet call to worship one God quickly turned into a threat to the power structures of Mecca's elite. Former friends became fierce enemies. Wealthy merchants saw their influence wane. Leaders feared the collapse of an order that had stood for centuries. The opposition was merciless. Muhammad's followers were beaten, tortured, even killed. Boycotts starved his clan. Assassination plots were whispered in the dark. And then came the most agonizing loss of all, the death of his beloved wife Khadija, the woman who had believed in him when the world doubted. Exile seemed the only option. Under the cover of night, Muhammad and his followers fled Mecca, embarking on the Hijra to Medina, a journey that would become the turning point in his mission. In Medina, he was not just a preacher but a statesman, a judge, a military strategist. Battles followed Badr, Uhud, the Trench, each shaping the destiny of his community. In less than a generation, the orphan of Mecca became the leader of a unified Arabia. His message transcended borders, languages, and centuries, spreading to every continent. Today, over 1 billion people trace their faith back to the words he recited in that mountain cave. But even now, more than 1,400 years after his passing, Muhammad's life remains the subject of fascination, devotion, debate, and misunderstanding. Who was the man behind the prophet? What trial shaped him? And how did an orphan merchant become one of the most influential figures the world has ever known? They once walked among the dunes, carrying nothing but faith and determination. But what happened next? Join the Hidden Billionaires to uncover his story. Long before the prophet's name echoed across continents, he was simply Muhammad ibn Abdullah, a child born into the prestigious Quraysh tribe of Mecca, yet cradled in the arms of tragedy from his first breath. His father, Abdullah, died before Muhammad was even born. For most, this would have meant a life condemned to poverty and obscurity. But his grandfather, Abdul Muttalib, was the respected leader of Mecca, the guardian of the Kaaba, the holiest sanctuary in Arabia. Even so, leadership could not shield a child from grief. When Muhammad was only 6, the desert winds turned cruel again. His mother, Amina, died on the long road back from visiting her family in Yathrib. Orphaned for the second time, the boy's small hands had to let go of his mother's gentle touch forever. From then on, he lived under the care of his grandfather. Abdul Muttalib cherished the boy, sensing something remarkable in him. Yet, fate was relentless. 2 years later, the old man died, leaving Muhammad in the guardianship of his uncle Abu Talib. Abu Talib was a kind and protective figure, but the family was far from wealthy. This meant that even as a child, Muhammad understood the dignity of work. He tended sheep in the barren hills around Mecca, a job that required patience, alertness, and solitude. Here, among the windswept rocks and silent stars, he learned to observe, to think, to listen, skills that would one day define his leadership. By his teens, Muhammad was accompanying trade caravans north to Syria. The desert routes were dangerous raiders, scorching heat, and treacherous terrain. But young Muhammad's honesty and diligence quickly became his signature. People began calling him Al-Amin the Trustworthy, a title few in the cutthroat world of Meccan commerce could claim. This reputation caught the attention of a wealthy merchant widow named Khadijah. She entrusted Muhammad with leading her trading caravans. The results were extraordinary. He returned not only with profit, but with every account balanced to the last coin and every promise kept. Khadijah, impressed by his integrity and noble character, proposed marriage. Despite being 15 years older, their bond was one of deep respect, love, and partnership. She was not just his wife, but his confidant and first believer, the anchor that steadied him in storms yet to come. Life in Mecca at that time revolved around tribal honor, the worship of many gods, and the control of lucrative trade routes. Yet Muhammad, even in prosperity, remained humble. He was known for feeding the poor, standing up for the oppressed, and keeping his word even when it cost him dearly. It was during these years that he began retreating to the cave of Hira, a quiet sanctuary on the slopes of Mount Nur. There he spent days in contemplation, disturbed by the idolatry, injustice, and inequality around him. Something in his heart told him that the world could be better and that a divine truth was waiting to be revealed. These early hardships, losing his parents, working from a young age, surviving in a society where power belonged to the ruthless, all shaped the man who would later stand alone against the most powerful leaders of his city. They gave him empathy for the poor, patience in the face of opposition, and the strength to carry a message that would change history. From an orphan boy in the alleys of Mecca to the respected merchant known across caravan routes, Muhammad's rise was not fueled by wealth or armies, but by something far rarer, a reputation so unshakable that even his fiercest enemies could not deny it. And yet nothing in his life so far could have prepared him for the night that would alter the destiny of nations, the moment when a voice from the unseen would command him to recite. The year was 610 CE. The night was still, the city of Mecca silent under a blanket of stars. On the slopes of Mount Nur, in the darkness of the cave of Hira, Muhammad sat in solitude, as he had many nights before, contemplating the injustices of the world and the restlessness in his heart. Then it happened. A presence unlike anything he had known filled the cave. The angel Gabriel appeared before him, enveloping the space in a force that seemed to press against his very soul. "Recite," the angel commanded. "I cannot recite," Muhammad replied, trembling. Again the command came, and again he answered the same. On the third time, the words poured from his lips, verses that would later become part of the Quran. "Recite in the name of your Lord who created man from a clot of blood. Recite, and your Lord is most generous." Shaken, terrified, Muhammad rushed down the mountain to Khadijah. He told her what had happened, his voice unsteady. Wrap me. Wrap me." She did, comforting him, then reassured him with words that would echo through history. "By Allah, He will never disgrace you. You keep good relations with your family, help the poor and destitute, serve your guests generously, and assist those in need." Khadijah took him to her cousin, Waraqah ibn Nawfal, a learned Christian scholar. Waraqah listened intently and confirmed, "This is the same Namus, the angel, who came to Moses. You are the prophet of this nation." But he warned the path ahead would be filled with hostility. At first, Muhammad shared the revelations quietly, inviting close family and friends to Islam. His circle grew Abu Bakr, Ali ibn Abi Talib, Uthman ibn Affan, and others. But when the command came to proclaim the message publicly, the city changed overnight. In the marketplaces, the Kaaba, and the open gatherings of Quraysh, Muhammad called for the worship of one God, Allah, and the abandonment of idols. He condemned corruption, urged fairness in trade, and demanded justice for the poor, the orphan, and the oppressed. To the common people, his words were hope. To the powerful, they were a threat. Mecca's leaders saw the danger if the people abandoned idol worship. The city's economic and political system, tied to the Kaaba's pagan pilgrimage, would collapse. The backlash was swift and brutal. Muhammad was mocked and called a liar, a madman, even a sorcerer. His followers were beaten in the streets. Some, like Bilal ibn Rabah, were tortured under the scorching desert sun, refusing to renounce their faith, whispering, "Ahad, Ahad, one, one." The Quraysh attempted to bribe Muhammad, offering him wealth, leadership, even kingship, if only he would stop preaching. His reply was unwavering. "If they placed the sun in my right hand and the moon in my left, I would not abandon this mission until Allah made it victorious or I perished in the effort. Persecution intensified. A social and economic boycott was imposed on his clan, forcing them into a valley where they nearly starved. In the midst of this, tragedy struck the death of Khadija and his uncle Abu Talib in the same year, a period known as the Year of Sorrow. Yet, in loss, Muhammad found new strength. He traveled to the city of Ta'ai if seeking support, but was met with rejection and abuse. Bloodied and exhausted, he prayed for guidance. Then came the night journey Isra and Miraj, a miraculous voyage where Muhammad traveled from Mecca to Jerusalem and ascended through the heavens, meeting prophets before him and standing in the presence of Allah. This event fortified his spirit and deepened the resolve of his followers. Over the next years, the small Muslim community continued to grow, drawing converts from across Arabia. Then came an invitation from Yathrib, later known as Medina, to come as a mediator between warring tribes. The Hijra, the migration to Medina in 622 CE, marked the beginning of a new chapter, not just for Muhammad, but for the Islamic calendar itself. In Medina, Muhammad was no longer just a preacher. He became the head of a state, drafting a constitution that granted religious freedom and bound Muslims, Jews, and other communities in mutual defense. From the cave on Mount Nur to the leadership of a thriving city, Muhammad's climb was unlike that of any worldly ruler. His power came not from armies or wealth, but from faith, resilience, and an unshakable belief that truth would prevail. The boy who once tended sheep on Mecca's hills had become a leader whose words and actions were shaping the destiny of a nation and soon the world. Medina welcomed Muhammad not just as a guest, but as a leader, a man entrusted to bring peace to a city long fractured by tribal rivalries. The Constitution of Medina bound Muslims, Jews, and pagan tribes in an unprecedented pact of mutual respect and defense. But peace, as history often proves, was fragile. The Quraysh of Mecca could not ignore this rising force. In their eyes, Muhammad was no longer a harmless preacher. He was the head of a growing state, commanding loyalty across Arabia. The first great test came at Badr. Outnumbered 3-1, the Muslims faced a Quraysh army in a valley south of Medina. For Muhammad, the stakes were existential. If they lost, Islam might be erased in its infancy. But against all odds, they won. The victory was seen as a sign of divine favor, and the message of Islam spread further. Yet triumph came at a cost. The Quraysh thirsted for revenge, and the following year they struck at Uhud. The battle began in the Muslims' favor, but a fateful mistake, archers abandoning their posts to seize spoils, turned victory into defeat. Muhammad himself was injured, his face wounded, his tooth broken. The loss was a sobering reminder. Leadership carried the weight of every decision and the pain of every fallen friend. Still, the Prophet pressed on. The stakes escalated during the Battle of the Trench, when a massive coalition of tribes besieged Medina. Instead of meeting them in open battle, Muhammad approved a bold, unconventional defense, digging a trench around the city, an unheard-of tactic in Arabia. Weeks of siege failed to break Medina, and the coalition dispersed. It was a turning point. The Quraysh's power was beginning to fracture. But leadership meant more than military strategy. Inside Medina, tensions sometimes flared between the Muslim community and other groups, including some Jewish tribes who, according to historical records, broke the terms of the pact. These breaches brought political fallout, alliances shifting like desert sand. The price of fame also reached into Muhammad's personal life. His role as leader meant constant negotiation, diplomacy, and the forging of marriages that strengthened alliances. Each decision was scrutinized. Every move weighed against both political necessity and moral example. Then came the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, a moment of restraint that tested his followers' patience. When the Muslims set out for Mecca to perform pilgrimage, they were stopped by the Quraysh. The treaty terms seemed humiliating, forcing them to return home without entering the city. But Muhammad saw beyond the present. The peace agreement allowed Islam to spread without interference, and within 2 years, Mecca itself would open its gates to him without bloodshed. For all the victories, the Prophet bore immense personal loss. Many of his closest companions died in battle. His beloved Uncle Hamza fell at Uhud, his body mutilated by the enemy. His daughters faced hardship, illness, and grief, and yet Muhammad's resolve never wavered. The more Islam grew, the more opposition it faced beyond Mecca, rival tribes, false prophets, and empires watching warily from afar. The Byzantine and Persian worlds, powerful and ancient, began to take notice of this new faith uniting Arabia under one God. By the time the conquest of Mecca came, Muhammad entered the city not as a vengeful conqueror, but as a man of mercy. Standing before the Kaaba, he declared amnesty for most of his former enemies, erasing years of bloodshed with forgiveness. Idols were removed from the sanctuary, and the Kaaba was restored to the worship of one God. But every step to that moment had been paid for in blood, in sleepless nights, in the crushing weight of responsibility. Leadership had brought him honor, yes, but also danger, betrayal, and grief that only deepened with time. The orphan boy of Mecca had become the most influential leader in Arabia, yet he remained deeply human, a man who laughed with his friends, wept at gravesides, and prayed in the stillness of the night for the very people who once sought his death. The fame, the power, the transformation of a nation all had come at a price, and the greatest trials were still to come. By the time the dust settled on the Arabian Peninsula, Muhammad had achieved what once seemed impossible, the unification of rival tribes under a single faith. The Quraysh, once his fiercest enemies, now stood beside him in prayer. The idols of the Kaaba were gone, and the call to worship one God echoed daily across Mecca and Medina. But peace was not a time of rest for the prophet. His mission had entered a new phase diplomacy on a scale Arabia had never seen. Letters were sent to kings and emperors beyond its borders. Heraclius of Byzantium, Khosrow II of Persia, rulers of Egypt, Abyssinia, and beyond. Some received his message with curiosity, others with hostility, but all now knew the name Muhammad. Medina, his adopted home, became the political and spiritual center of a rapidly expanding community. It was here that he continued to teach, to lead prayers, to resolve disputes, and to guide the faithful in matters both worldly and divine. Yet he lived simply sleeping on a mat of palm fibers, mending his own clothes, and sharing meals with the poor. Even in these years of strength, danger remained. New challenges rose from tribes, breaking their agreements, testing the fragile unity of Arabia. Muhammad personally led expeditions to ensure the peace held, knowing that without stability, the community could fracture. Then, in the year 632 CE, came the farewell pilgrimage, his only complete Hajj after Islam's victory. On the plain of Arafat, before tens of thousands, he delivered a sermon that would echo through history. He spoke of the sanctity of life and property, the equality of all believers regardless of race or tribe, the rights of women, and the finality of his prophethood. "I have conveyed the message," he declared, and the crowd responded, "Yes, you have." Shortly after returning to Medina, he fell ill. Fever and weakness confined him to the room of his wife Aisha, where he continued to lead prayers as long as he could. One morning, the mosque was filled with worshippers when he drew aside the curtain and smiled at them a moment etched in memory as a final blessing. On the 12th of Rabi al-Awwal, in the 11th year of the Islamic calendar, Muhammad passed away at the age of 63. The news spread like a shockwave. Many refused to believe it. Umar ibn al-Khattab stood in the mosque, denying the loss until Abu Bakr, his closest friend, reminded them, "Muhammad is but a messenger. Messengers have passed before him. If he dies or is slain, will you turn back on your heels?" The city wept. Men and women who had once plotted against him now mourned him. The orphan who had walked the streets of Mecca alone had left a united nation behind. Yet with his passing came a new uncertainty. Without the prophet's presence, would the unity hold? Would the message endure beyond his generation? These questions would shape the decades and centuries to come. What could never be denied was the transformation he had set in motion. From the harsh tribal codes of pre-Islamic Arabia had emerged a society bound by a common faith, guided by principles of justice, charity, and community. Muhammad's final years had been marked by peace hard-won, victories without vengeance, and a steadfast humility that kept him grounded even as the world's gaze turned toward him. But history was not done with his name. In the centuries ahead, his life would be told and retold in devotion, in scholarship, in art, and sometimes in distortion. The man who once tended sheep in Mecca had become a figure whose legacy reached far beyond the desert, a leader whose storm had passed, but whose influence would never fade. Muhammad's passing in 632 CE left behind not only a united Arabian Peninsula, but also a family whose lives were deeply interwoven with the birth of Islam. His household, known as Al-Bayt, would carry both the honor and the heavy burden of his legacy. He had no surviving sons. All three of his boys, Qasim, Abdullah, and Ibrahim, had died in childhood. His lineage continued through his daughters, Zainab, Ruqayya, Kulthum, and Fatima. Of them, Fatima was the closest in both heart and faith, often called the leader of the women of paradise in Islamic tradition. She married Ali ibn Abi Talib, Muhammad's cousin and one of his earliest followers, and together they had two sons, Hassan and Hussein, whose names would become central in Islamic history. Muhammad's widows, honored as the mothers of the believers, each carried unique roles in preserving and transmitting his teachings. Aisha bint Abi Bakr, the youngest, became one of the most prominent narrators of his sayings and actions, shaping the hadith literature that would guide Muslims for generations. Hafsa, the daughter of Umar ibn al-Khattab, safeguarded the earliest written compilation of the Quran. Leadership after Muhammad was a question that had no simple answer. Before his burial, the community gathered to choose a successor. Abu Bakr, his closest companion and father-in-law, was elected as the first caliph. His role was not to replace the prophet, for Muhammad's prophethood was final, but to lead the Muslim community as its political and spiritual guardian. The succession set in motion events that would shape Islamic civilization. Under Abu Bakr, the unity Muhammad had built was tested as some tribes sought independence. The Ridda Wars reasserted the unity of the Ummah, ensuring that the message Muhammad brought would not fracture in its first days without him. Yet the deeper legacy of Muhammad lay not in political arrangements, but in the principles he instilled: justice, equality, mercy, and devotion to God. His family embodied these values, but they were also caught in the political currents of the young Muslim state. Hassan and Hussein, in particular, would one day stand at the heart of one of Islam's most defining tragedies, the events of Karbala, decades after their grandfather's death. Beyond politics, Muhammad's descendants and companions carried his mission across continents. Traders, scholars, and warriors spread Islam to Persia, North Africa, and beyond. Within a single century, lands that had never heard his name now echoed with the call to prayer. The simplicity of Muhammad's own life left a lasting impression. He left no gold or silver, no palaces or armies for his family to inherit. His wealth was in the Quran, the community, and the moral example he set. His home in Medina remained humble, a reminder that leadership was service, not privilege. Generations later, his family's name, Sayyid or Sharif, became a mark of descent from him, revered in many Muslim societies. Yet with that honor came a weight of expectation, as each generation was measured against the moral and spiritual standard he had set. In the immediate years after his passing, his companions worked tirelessly to preserve his words and actions, compiling them into collections of hadith that would become second only to the Quran in guiding Islamic life. The community remembered him not only as a prophet, but as a father, a husband, a friend, a man whose laughter was gentle, whose anger was just, and whose prayers were whispered for others more than for himself. Muhammad's family and followers inherited not an empire in the traditional sense, but a mission to carry forward a faith that had begun in a cave with a single word: recite. And though the prophet himself was gone, the unity and momentum he created ensured that his message would not fade. More than 14 centuries have passed since Muhammad walked the streets of Mecca and Medina, yet his name remains among the most spoken on earth. Every day, in every time zone, the call to prayer carries the words, "Muhammad is the messenger of Allah," echoing from minarets into city streets, mountain villages, and desert plains. His influence is not measured only in the number of his followers, over 1.9 billion today, but in the civilization that grew from the principles he taught. Under his message, literacy spread, trade flourished, and diverse peoples were united by a common moral and legal framework. The Quran, preserved in the very words revealed to him, remains a cornerstone of faith and identity for Muslims worldwide. The industries he transformed were not of commerce alone, but of the human spirit. In a region once fractured by tribal wars and vendettas, he replaced blood feuds with brotherhood, idolatry with monotheism, and social inequality with the idea that the most honored before God is the most righteous, not the most powerful. Historians, even those outside the faith, have acknowledged his profound impact. The 19th century historian William Draper ranked him as the greatest influence in human history. Michael H. Hart in the 100 placed Muhammad at number 1, citing his unparalleled combination of religious and political leadership. Yet, his legacy is not without challenges. Across centuries, his life and message have been interpreted in countless ways in poetry and art, in law and philosophy, in devotion and sometimes distortion. To his followers, he is the ultimate role model. To critics, he is a figure whose life demands understanding beyond the lens of their own time and culture. What endures beyond debate is the tangible transformation he achieved in just 23 years of public life. He left no empire in the conventional sense, yet the state he founded continued to expand for centuries, carrying his message from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. Cities of learning Baghdad, Cairo, Cordoba grew from the intellectual foundations of his teachings. Educational institutions, charitable foundations, and legal systems bear the imprint of his example. From zakat, charitable giving, to the protection of orphans and the weak, his directives became embedded in the societal DNA of vast regions. His sayings, hadith, are quoted not only in mosques, but in everyday conversation, shaping moral norms and personal behavior. There is no monument grand enough to contain his legacy, but there are millions of lives that reflect it. In every act of kindness done in his name, in every prayer whispered at dawn, in every treaty signed with justice, his influence continues. To some, he is a timeless legend, a man who rose from orphanhood to become the most influential leader in history. To others, he is a cautionary tale about the weight of leadership and the trials it brings. But to those who follow him, he is the final prophet, the mercy to the worlds, whose life offers a complete example for how to live with faith, humility, and strength. 1400 years later, his words still inspire revolutions of the heart. His legacy is carried not only in the vast ummah that spans the globe, but in the simple truth he lived by that one person, armed with conviction and compassion, can change the course of humanity. From the dusty streets of Mecca to the leadership of a united Arabia, Muhammad's life reads like an epic, but it was no work of fiction. It was a journey carved in loss, built on resilience, and driven by a mission that outlived him by more than 14 centuries. He began life as an orphan, with no wealth, no armies, and no worldly power. Yet, through integrity, patience, and an unshakable belief in the truth he carried, he reshaped not only his own society, but the course of world history. In just 23 years of public mission, he overturned systems of injustice, united feuding tribes, and inspired a faith that today spans the globe. His climb was never easy. Every step was shadowed by sacrifice, the loss of loved ones, betrayal by allies, persecution by his own people, and the constant burden of leadership. But in those moments when lesser men might have surrendered, Muhammad chose mercy over revenge, principle over compromise, and hope over despair. The legacy he left is more than religion. It is a code for life, one that champions justice, compassion, and equality. His teachings gave dignity to the poor, rights to women, and a voice to the voiceless. His example continues to challenge the powerful and comfort the oppressed. And yet, his life is also a reminder that greatness comes at a cost. The very success that elevated him also brought endless trials. Leadership demanded not only vision, but the strength to endure loneliness, loss, and relentless opposition. The price of fame, for Muhammad, was measured not in gold, but in sleepless nights, in the tears shed for his people, and in the weight of responsibility he carried to his last breath. So, was the price worth paying? For Muhammad, the answer was in his final sermon, a message to all of humanity. Live with justice, hold fast to faith, and treat each other as equals before God. His mission was never about his own name, but about a truth he believed belonged to all. Centuries later, the orphan of Mecca still inspires millions to rise above hardship, to lead with integrity, and to stand firm in the face of adversity. His life is proof that the humblest beginnings can lead to the most enduring legacies. They once called him Al-Amin, the Trustworthy. History remembers him as the prophet of Islam, but his true legacy is carried in the hearts of those who live by the principles he taught. If you found this story eye-opening, subscribe and stay tuned for more hidden truths from the world's most influential figures.